Hello everyone. In this set of videos, I will be introducing the work and research that went into my doctoral dissertation, which is right here, the Cooperative Economy. I would like to thank Exploring Economics, with whom I've coordinated this series of videos. The idea was that this work, which itself is surely a valuable contribution to the research in economics and related disciplines, is too valuable to just leave on a shelf. It's 782 pages of text, 46 pages of bibliography, so it's quite an extensive work. I doubt very few scholars or general population members will be reading the book, so I thought a set of videos to explain, outline, and guide a general audience through the content would be very useful. So the idea is this first video will be a general outline of the dissertation itself, followed by a chapter-by-chapter guide of the contents of the dissertation. Again, the title of the work is The Cooperative Economy Towards a Stakeholder-Led Democracy, and I will get into why I chose that title through this talk. My name is Jerome Warren. And again, thanks to Exploring Economics for the interest and the collaboration in publishing this to their audience. I think that this would be certainly something that would be useful to the heterodox community in general. So generally, the outline of my presentation will be as follows. I will first explain the main research questions of the dissertation, followed by an explanation of the approach taken, which it's a combination of three approaches: contributions to democratic theory, to the theory of the firm, as well as to cooperative theory or the theory of cooperatives. Then I will look at why traditional approaches or orthodox, if you will, neoclassical economic approaches are not sufficient to deal with these questions. Lastly, getting into the issues of communication, which form a central place in the dissertation, and followed by a conclusion. So the main research questions are: what does a general theory of cooperation look like? Of course, taking inspiration from the general theory of Keynes on prices and wages and money. Again, the idea, of course, similar to Keynes, is that we cannot always take cooperation as a given, that we must develop theories that take exceptional cases into consideration. Otherwise, we don't have a general theory, and we don't have a specific one. So moving away from models like Homo economicus and other similar concepts towards dynamic understandings of what it is that promotes, generates, and maintains cooperation. Secondly, more specifically, how does cooperative business differ from traditional business? So investor-owned firms, how do labor-managed firms differ from capital-managed or owned firms, in the language of Gregory Dow? Third, what elements are needed to develop a suitable theoretical architecture for describing the function of what Oliver Williamson and authors call consummate cooperation, according to certain principles? So this distinguished from the sort of perfunctory or instrumental cooperation that one sees in the traditional, as we say, capitalist firm, where you have a wage contract and people work, they are monitored, they shirk, and you have things like moral hazard. This is not what consummate cooperation is. It refers to a more deeper and abiding sense that intrinsic motivation and reciprocal, yes, I guess you would say reciprocal monitoring. And what elements are needed for describing and cultivating transitions to democratic governance. So this, for me, was a very important topic, as one oftentimes is talking about a firm type A and a firm type B. So we have a cooperative firm, we have a capitalist firm, and these are kept separate. But of course, in the economy, so few cooperatives are formed every year in most countries, aside from Italy, perhaps every year, that one of the necessary policy for developments will have to be converting traditional capitalist firms into cooperatives. So looking at these transitional regimes and parameters was of deep interest to me in this work. And then why are neoclassical theories insufficient to dealing or analyzing these issues? And of course, this research finds itself within a broader tradition. Just a few of those books, not exhaustive here, listed on the right. We have here The Labor Managed Firm. I've already mentioned Greg Dow, very vital contribution to the mathematical or economic or formal economic theories of the firm, and looking at how neoclassical theories may actually not be sufficient to dealing with some of the asymmetries of that cooperatives face in the economy. Here, Cooperative Species by Sam Bowles and Herbert Gintis, looking at basically the nature of human behavior as something that's modeled as reciprocally determinate. So very much critiquing the Homo economicus model of human beings as atomized, self-interesting utility maximizers, and developing an alternative notion of preference formation and also cooperation interaction. Looking back at the archaeological record and anthropological studies, a number of interdisciplinary, empirical, also theoretical contributions in this very important book. The International Handbook of Cooperative Law, people like Antonio Ficci and Hagen Henry, who have been very vital in developing a corpus of specifically cooperative law, looking not to merely borrow from standard corporate law and other types, but to developing again, a corpus of law dedicated to the distinct needs and characteristics of cooperatives in an international setting. I have here Immanuel Kant and his work on Sittlichkeit, on ethics, as well as his critique of judgment, Kritik der Urteilskraft, his last critique of his main corpus, where he's developing a more empirically based notion of judgment, of choice, of distinctions, and very vital for the cybernetic movement, actually. Here's a new book brought out by the editors Lucio Bigiero, The Relational View of Economics, as well as Joseph Wieland, a few other individuals involved there, changing the basic notion of transactions in the economy from a exchange transaction to a relational transaction, looking at things like relational governance, relational contracts, basically moving away from the nodes in a network to their connections, the edges. What are the relations between individuals rather than what are their characteristics? Because much of what we are is defined by the social context in which we are. So very innovative new paradigm developing there. Lastly here, Lud Leidesdorf, The Evolutionary Dynamics of Discursive Knowledge, again, looking at communication within science, between science and policy and the economy. So how do mutual relations between profit maximization, the regulatory functions of government, and the innovative functions of the university or academy create synergies, mutually influence another, lead to specializations. And there's lots of other literature there in which this contribution finds itself. So firstly, I want to get into the approaches that I take within this dissertation. The first approach are contributions to democratic theory. Of course, here on the right, we have the bust in the Pergamon Museum of Pericles, the famed Athenian statesman, who, of course, in his funeral oration suggested that the advancement in public life in Athens falls to reputations for capacity, class considerations not being allowed to interfere with merit. So the Athenian ordinary citizens, though occupied with the pursuits of industry, are still fair judges of public matters. He also defined democracy as a situation where public affairs are managed by the majority, not specifically not in the name or in the interest of the majority, and provided numerous non-instrumental justifications for democracy, suggesting that as a city, we are the school of Hellas, so we are the school of the Greeks, looking at democracy as a process, pedagogical sense. I also get into some of the connections between democracy and Republican thought, Republican with a small r, not talking about the American political party, but rather the tradition of republicanism that developed in northern Italy before and during the Renaissance, so about the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, maybe into the 15th as well. And also within that context, there is the reconnection between the Italian city-states with Greek thought, as in the 15th century, 14th century, already starting, as many of you know, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium or the Byzantine Empire, was in a state of collapse with the Ottoman conquest in 1453. This collapse was complete, and many Greek refugees found refuge, in fact, in Italy, in the sort of the relics of the Western Roman Empire, and brought with them a bunch of literature on, in addition to speculative philosophy, theology, as well, democratic thought. So rekindling that flame. And so we see a definite connection, this type of genealogy between the Greek thought and the Italian Renaissance. I also look at the relationship between slavery and democracy, attempting to continue the research developed by Moses Finley and others who comment that these two phenomena, the rise of chattel slavery and democracy, were simultaneous, that there's a bit of a tension or maybe even a paradox there. And this crystallizes, as I see it, in European notions, thoughts like the dialectic of Hegel. He talks about what he calls the Herr-Knecht dialectic, the master-slave dialectic, as it's oftentimes translated in English. It could be also the master-servant dialectic, which many have attributed the roots of the current employment contract to. And in fact, in my dissertation, The Cooperative Economy, I argue that the notion of capital as a social relation that Marx develops goes back to Marx's reading of Hegel and has a clear pedagogical aspect, particularly on the basis of reading Hegel via Susan Buck Morris's Hegel in Haiti. I try to re-inject the dichotomy of slavery and citizenship, that is, the juxtaposition of the domains of freedom and necessity. Who gets to participate in the pleasures of life, creating poetry, mathematical treatises, taking part in public debates, and so on, versus necessity, what needs to be done, tilling the fields, feeding the population, taking care of the essentials, defense, and so on. And the ethical implications this dichotomy entails, and which Hegel captures in his dialectic, into the domain of political economy, where Adam Smith and similar thinkers had stealthily actually avoided the topic, as Marvin Brown, the philosopher, argues, to the detriment of the field. Thus, Smith never considered the implication of slavery on the production of the wealth of nations, and only mentions slavery in passing once or twice in his work. As argued in a moment, the inclusion of this dichotomy necessitates a focus on ethics and communication. And in fact, it requires a focus on democratic choice, including mechanisms like consensus, which is often dismissed as being time-consuming, and sortition, which was in fact applied regularly in Athenian life. Most positions, many do not know, in the Athenian democracy were not filled by voting, but in fact by lotteries. So things like their parliaments, their courts, and other institutions were actually allotted via a very complex and advanced machinery that chose lots. So democratic values are also incredibly central to my research. As I say, ethics is important, and thus notions like inclusion, equity, and accountability form central pillars of my research, and I've developed some indicators in the dissertation, which I will get into in later chapters of the, or I guess videos describing the chapters of the book. So look forward to that. And I also contribute to what David Ellerman has called a neo-abolitionist tradition, which places emphasis on the importance of law and jurisprudence in undergirding what Adam Smith and others called the invisible hand. And in fact, I do follow Ellerman's criticism of neoclassical economics' blindness to the implications of jurisprudential reforms on economic behavior. Katharina Pistor has recently written a book, The Code of Capital, outlining just this type of a communication or dialectic between power, law, and practices in the codification of law. And Ellerman himself follows in a tradition that includes the German legal scholar Otto von Gierke. Lots more to say on those issues in the coming videos. The second approach that I take is, in fact, the theory of the firm, or contributions to the theory of the firm. And here, of course, on the left, you have Ronald Coase. And I do see that the theory of the firm is there's a growing literature on this topic, which is rather recent within the economics discipline. In many ways, about 100 years ago, 120 years ago, it started out as carve-outs from the neoclassical model that was then developing as people pondered this notion of perfect competition and the paradox that at the same time what represents the majority of economic transactions was occurring within firms. So how does one square the fact that you ideally have the ability to transact in the market for all inputs and output products and services, yet we do see these clusters of organized power, I think is what one economist, Lena Robbins, called it, within the sort of a buttermilk within the milk of markets. And so Burl and Means, of course, are innovators in this regard, as well as Ronald Coase, who I've said, of course, is here on the left. Later, there was a more and more focus on what was called incomplete contracts, the fact that one can never fully monitor and enforce contracts, say for labor. You can't stand behind your employee all the time, looking over the shoulder to see if they are exerting the amount of effort that you actually expect them to. This is incomplete contracts. And of course, issues like information asymmetry. If you buy an insurance policy, you're not going to tell the insurer that maybe you had cancer or whatever it is. Things like adverse selection, moral hazard, etc. And in particular, I focus in the earlier chapters and in my research on what is called post-Walrasian theories, so moving beyond the theories of Léon Walras, Swiss economist who developed this neoclassical framework with perfect competition, viewing firms as price takers. And the post-Walrasian theories, to many extent, could be described as constitutive or even constructivist frameworks, where particularly either individual preferences or enforcement of contracts, depending on which part of the post-Walrasian tradition you're part of, are constitutive. That means they are constructed and continually regenerated in exchange. There's lots more to say there, and I should stop myself before I get too far ahead of myself and just focus on these three particular issues that I find vital. And these are the three main departures from neoclassical models and its offshoots. And in particular, that is what Gregory Dow, of course, I'm agreeing here with the basic assumptions of Gregory Dow, or his basic conclusions rather. He has the asymmetry, the replication and imperfection principles. The asymmetry principle I have listed here basically boils down to the fact that capital is not labor. Writes Dow, although they are necessary, market imperfections are not sufficient to explain patterns like compressed wage structures, less elastic quantity responses to prices in cooperative enterprise, and so on, because such imperfections may have symmetric effects on traditional firms and cooperatives. That means one can't just say that there are these differences in the fact that there are fewer cooperatives in existence, that one does see more adverse types of contracts, employment contracts, does not mean that the market is imperfect, again, because these market imperfections also apply to those traditional firms, the capitalist firms as well. Thus, concludes Dow, any theory claiming to explain the empirical asymmetries between the two types, must identify a causally relevant asymmetry between capital and labor. And of course, I have, in the dissertation, in this huge work, gone to lengths to describe these distinctions, and particularly I embrace the view of Paul Cockshott and others in that tradition of the type of econophysical left econophysics, who suggests that labor is a universal machine, so to speak, universally applicable, whereas if you have, say, a robot, they are programmed to perform certain functions, and even deep learning instruments are very limited in their universality of that learning. Even Google's AI, can beat you at Go or at chess, but it can't identify a moral dilemma and solve that dilemma as a human being can. So human beings are nearly universally, uh, how would you say, applicable in the productive process. They can be trained very easily and are adaptable. And this is what distinguishes labor from capital, which, of course, Marx described as valorized labor, old labor, so to speak. The second principle is the replication principle, which emphasizes the distinction between market and hierarchy that Oliver Williams made as being incorrect, at least incorrect in emphasis. Writes down, it would not be satisfactory to explain hypothetical productivity advantages of traditional firms by asserting that they have managerial hierarchies but cooperatives do not. There is nothing about the principle of ultimate control by labor suppliers that rules out the use of managerial hierarchy. Again, the point is what one can replicate in a cooperative from a traditional firm, such as hierarchies, CEOs, the division of labor, should not be used to explain the empirical distinctions in the presence or absence of cooperatives. So the fact that cooperatives can have managers cannot be used as an argument to explain why there are so few cooperatives in the world. The last of these principles is the imperfection principle, which describes the fact that market failures, that is, deviations from perfect competitions, matter. Says Dow, in an environment of complete and competitive markets, control rights can be assigned to any set of input suppliers or output demanders without endangering allocative efficiency. So even customers can be the owners of a firm, which is the case, for instance, in a consumer cooperative. In fact, the cooperative exhibits behavioral and efficiency properties of the Walrasian firm. So in principle, you can have a workers' cooperative or consumer cooperative that is just as efficient according to the neoclassical model of Walras as an investor-owned firm. Therefore, the task facing both advocates and skeptics of workers' control is to identify market failures that differently affect labor-managed and capital-managed firms, or cooperatives and capitalist firms, however we describe them. These three main distinctions, and certainly there are others, demand a relational perspective that is entrenched in recurring and regenerating non-exchange transactions. Thus, my work takes the relational transaction as its locus, focusing on the need to distribute relational rents, and is thus a contribution to the Copernican turn in economics. I get into some of this more extensively in later videos. Again, this is just a basic introduction. The third approach I take is contributions to the theory of cooperatives or to cooperative theory. And in fact, there is, although there aren't many books on the topic, and especially if you take an economics course, you aren't going to learn very much about cooperatives or cooperation, since there's a focus almost exclusively on competition as the logic that determines outcomes in the economy. There is a long history of cooperative theory. So not only in economics, but also in biology. You have, for instance, Charles Darwin, who in his Origin of Species saw what later became called multi-level or group selection as essential to evolutionary processes, which was later taken up by Pyotr Kropotkin, a Russian aristocrat and scientist, in his concept of mutual aid, and Edward O. Wilson, who recently actually passed away, American evolutionary biologist, who in his career dedicated a lot of time and effort to describing the evolution of eusociality or strong sociality. And all these are very relevant for cooperative theory. Um, I, in fact, am interested in contributing to attempts to inject these discussions into economics, which have in the past been led by people like Kyle Polanyi, Samuel Bowles, Herbert Gintis, and others. And in fact, these theories can be applied to cooperative enterprises which employ principles-driven governance. And in the cooperative economy, I interpret and analyze the cooperative principles as propensities in the sense of Karl Popper. Co-ops have a lot of great empirical qualities, as the research by Virginia Perrotin and others in recent decades have shown. They act to reduce uncertainty, but also to democratize and decommodify inputs, as they're called in economics, vis-a-vis de-skilling and other processes that were seen historically in the rise of the capitalist system. So on the right is a picture of the store on Toad Lane in Rochdale near Manchester in England, which is a early example of this type of decommodification, communal organization. Of course, at the same time, they also possess their own challenges. They're not a panacea. Both elements must be studied in their own right to produce new knowledge. And an example of this, of course, is the recent focus on harmonization of cooperative law by Hagen Henry, I mentioned earlier. And in fact, there is a history of unproductive attempts at developing economic theory for cooperatives. One of these developed in Yugoslavia in the last century, under the guise of the Illyrian firm. You had Ward and Domack and Vania. Much of the qualitative research also on workplace democracy, according to a study by Weber and others, occurs in traditional firms. Thus, cooperatives are often forced to adopt standard solutions that are not valid in their particular circumstances, and these lead to demutualization or the conversion of a cooperative into traditional business. Thus, in order to avoid losing generations of collective or shared value creation, there is a need for developing testable economic theories for cooperatives, and in particular for connecting the literature on cooperatives with stakeholder literature. In particular, since the 1995 review of the International Cooperative Alliance, or ICA's cooperative principles and values, the focus on multi-stakeholding has been given more attention by the international cooperative movement. In the world of organizations where value is increasingly driven by networks and knowledge commons, the extension of membership beyond merely laborers has become increasingly paramount. This is in fact why, in part, why I chose to name my dissertation towards a stakeholder-led democracy instead of merely focusing on relations of capital and labor respective to ownership, participation, and control. Thus, to very briefly outline, the cooperative economy outlines three main empirical research strands and presents preliminary results. I will get into these again, as I say, in later videos. Now I wanted to mention why heterodox views are not sufficient to describe and analyze these notions. Following Anwar Sheikh, I suggest that mainstream views assume a Garden of Eden approach that is very mythological and very much influenced by the history of European social thought. Here on the left, of course, we have Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Paradise Lost, John Milton. A contemporary of Milton, of course, was Thomas Hobbes, who had a very pessimistic view of human nature, living during the English Revolution there with Oliver Cromwell, as well as his view, as well as John Stuart Mill's and their lasting impact on economics, it is my argument, hinders progress. Of course, Hobbes with his notion that life is nasty, brutish, and short, Mill with his notion that political economy should focus exclusively on pecuniary interests. Of course, at the same time, John Stuart Mill also stated that the form of association, which, if mankind continues to improve, must be expected in the end to predominate, is not that of which can be said to exist between a capitalist as chief and workpeople without voice. in the management, but the association of laborers themselves on terms of equality, collectively owning the capital with which they carry on their operations and working under managers elected and removable by themselves. Although he said that, Mill never specified how to arrive there if economic analysis is only to concern itself with pecuniary self-interest. Also, there's no reason why the price mechanism must be privileged in economic analysis. Uh, Paul Cockshot's critique of Hayek's interpretation of the role of the price mechanism is relevant here, as is Pat Devine's notion of negotiated coordination, which emphasizes, in fact, quantity responses to changes instead of merely price changes. Thus, while neoclassical economics skirts the issue by hiding behind the price mechanism, responding to questions of scarcity with reference to willingness to pay without considering distinctions in ability, a focus on quantity reaction emphasizes the very real ethical questions that arise in the provision of goods and services. It is these ethical questions that demand a democratic form of governance. Thus, the cooperative economy demonstrates that democratic governance can't be explained by traditional utility-based models. Questions of organizing the domains of necessity and freedom that I've mentioned before require reflection, judgment, politics, philosophy, and what Cornelius Castoriadis called the civic or social imaginary. And fair assessments of cooperative business must at least make three main departures I've outlined above. Thus, the why of cooperation has been discussed extensively in the form of, in biology, discussing pre-adaptations that facilitate later behavioral shifts and adaptations to more socially determined contexts that are not only present in human beings, but also bees and other insects. And then from a more economic standpoint, you have the reduction of uncertainty in phenomena like insurance, which in principle are also collective uh, forms of cooperation. Thus, more focus at present and in the future, and in particular in my dissertation, go into the how of cooperation, looking at the notion of relational rents that are generated and that also require distribution, and looking at the notion of co-determination that also looks not only at personal utility maximization, but the effect of social norms on determining behavior. So this is why it's co-determination, because both matter. Certainly, we do have self-interest, and we do act to maximize that self-interest in certain contexts. In other contexts, it's entirely inappropriate. So there must be more focus on the events and processes that actually contribute to determining proper behavior and that also generate preferences. So these are reciprocal, what Andrew Bandura called reciprocally determined and not distinct uh, sort of cubby holes or distinct areas. And all of this requires a network approach. In the end, my research determined that the suitable distinction in economic behavior is not one of rationality versus norm-based approaches, but rather one of juxtaposing disembedded and embedded thinking, both in the sense of Polanyi, but also in terms of a relational perspective. That is, if individual behavior is embedded in a network, what Hegel refers to as system, then the view, for instance, towards the constraints should not merely view these as costs, but also emphasize the benefits constraints impose on the whole network. Looking here, for instance, at the example that I mentioned of John Elster, looking at the Hays Code stimulating creative filmmaking and Hollywood's golden era, and also notions like collective entrepreneurship of Philip DeWoot, as well as creating shared value of Kramer and Porter. All of this means that stakeholders' views, opinions, preferences, and input must be included ex ante and not just ex post in terms of redistribution. So we have Ellerman's notion of pre-distribution. And this requires an emphasis on discourse, not only strategy. That is to say, a general theory of cooperation must recognize the contribution of all three logics, as Arrow suggests, of bargaining, authority, and discourse towards the end of analyzing and understanding cooperation in the economy. Thus, much of the existing literature, for instance, Hassani, Aumann, Shapley, and others, has considered primarily either bargaining or authority. Especially within the domain of economics, there has been insufficient focus on discourse. And of course, if we discuss discourse, we have to discuss discourse ethics. Habermas is a source here. Again, lastly, as I said, I wanted to get into the notion of communication that forms a central pillar in my work. And in fact, I look at both communications and ecology as valid domains within economy. And my final theoretical chapter, chapter 8, is particularly inspired by both Lud Leidersdorf's attempt to synthesize Habermas and Luhmann's approaches and Bob Ulanovich's attempt to develop a suitable foundation for describing ecological processes. These approaches are viewed as means by which what Pfeffer called organizational effectiveness, or what Devine discusses as negotiated coordination, occur. In fact, I'm very much influenced here by Maureen Brown's notion that both ecology and economy are mutually beneficial. That ecology discusses the logos, the understanding of the household, the oikos, while economy focuses on the nomos, or the managing of the oikos. And one cannot manage, as Brown suggests, what one does not understand. So if we look outside the window today, we see a knowledge economy, what others have called a knowledge economy, very much heavily focused in the service sector, that forces us to ask what is evolving within society itself in these types of social systems. It is not genes, they're not selfish genes, it's not selfish knowledge, to apply that notion from Richard Dawkins. But in fact, it's interaction, as Leidesdorf suggests, between communication codes and historical events that are continually incurring on those events to interpret them and orient them in people's minds. So the cultural genotype, as opposed to the biological one, is not hardwired. So this means that new regimes, logics, and goal sets can actually enter the discussion. So looking at one example, the sustainability discourse that has entered the discussion in the last couple of decades. So ultimately, traditional tools like game theory are only poorly equipped to deal with these types of issues. The cooperative economy suggests a cooperative n-tuple helix following Leidesdorf and others to deal with these types of interactions. This approach formalizes the interaction between multiple logics with elements of redundancy, that is, overlap and mutual influence, and specialization. Together with individuals like Lucio Bighiero, Josef Wieland, Klaus Krippendorf, and others, I'm attempting to develop a general framework, a lexicon for dealing with the implications of self-organizing in complex systems like societies, the role of voluntary coordination, it's often called self-organization, and cooperation is central to this effort. It is necessarily an interdisciplinary effort. Thus, complex social settings cannot be maximized since there are multiple logics that have to, so to speak, compromise. Uh, and we do need a multi-stakeholder dialogue to deal with distributional questions. And as the adage goes, you can have too much of a good thing. Cooperatives can serve a pivotal role in making society-level plans, as I argue, and as they have of necessity developed an extensive framework of principles-based communication to facilitate organizational effectiveness and negotiated coordination in an otherwise quite hostile environment. They should thus be promoted within the context of many of the demographic, political, social, economic, ecological, and other challenges of both the present and the future. And just to conclude, I am of the belief that cooperatives can serve a role in the context of present global challenges, and that as principles-driven enterprises, they can connect with government and multilateral organizations for mission-driven investment and innovation. They can, in fact, square the circle of democracy, economy, and social goals like planning. Thus, the cooperative economy has attempted to build on existing literature, moving beyond it to set up an epistemic and methodological toolkit, including democratic theory, the theory of the firm, and cooperative theory for reorienting economic analysis towards harnessing collective enterprise more specifically, and analyzing transitions towards more democratic governance, and lastly, for enabling a transition more generally, seeing cooperation more generally as an ordering logic within the economy. So again, as I say, although I look at cooperatives primarily as an example, this is an attempt to build a general theory of cooperation, so it should apply as well inside as well as outside of cooperatives, and particularly towards a transition. So thank you for listening. And I do hope that you will enjoy the next videos that will go more extensively into the details of what I've been working on here in this book.